All systems go. Clear for liftoff.
What's going on, golf fans? It's your boy GS Luke here with our DFS live stream for the Tour Championship. It's the last regular event of the season before we've got ourselves the fall swing in a few weeks. So let's take advantage. We got ourselves a star-studded field as well, and also a golf course that I was lucky enough to walk through last year and get an idea of how it played after renovation. So I feel like I have a leg up of maybe some other people on how it's going to play. Excited to potentially take advantage of that this week, and excited, of course, to have another golf slate to take down. So hopefully a week has been treating you guys nicely. You're ready to get after all of this golf action. Feel free to hit me up with any specific questions that you've got in the live chat. That can be player pool deep dives, any process-based stuff for this week, maybe how to handle a 30-player field, whatever the case may be. Feel free to let me know. But a few things that we're going to talk through together. That'll include the weather. We're going to go through ownership from 8K plus. We're also going to talk through some lineup construction towards the end. And anything on top of that you're curious about, everything is fair game in the chat. So you got Steven down there says, let's roll that dimple ball. I couldn't say it better myself. Amen to that. Let's hope we get some run good on those greens. And let's talk about the Tour Championship. So first things first, let's make sure we're all on the same page for this week, because this Tour Championship's a little bit different than what we've had over the last few years. Normally, there's a handicapping process that occurs after the BMW Championship, where you had guys starting at -10 over the last few events, and then some guys that were starting at even par. So it was based on where you ended up in the FedEx Cup rankings. Number one was at -10. Number two started at -8, but that entire format was scrapped for 2025. So this is essentially just a regular no-cut event. The difference from some of the other no-cut events that we've had is that there's only 30 players, which means that the spread from the first to the last tee time is only like 3 hours. So not quite as, a big of a field as we normally have at these kind of events. But rather than having a clear-cut winner, Scotty, that was minus money to start the week last year, he's only plus 200 this time around, which is still ridiculous, even in the 30-player field, that he has those kind of odds, but a little bit different here for this season. And it's also worth noting that the golf course did get renovated last year. That was the part of the reason that I wanted to be there on site to see some of those changes. And it did play easier, but that's partially because they made it a par 71. It was typically a par 70 setup. They made, I believe it was 12 or 14, one of those two holes, a par 5 for last year's event. Rather than playing it as a par 71, they're going back to the par 70 this year. So that's really the big course change from 2024 to 2025. The renovation, though, that happened before last year's event was where a vast majority of those changes happened. So last year, driving accuracy was probably the most important stat that we had in terms of correlation to success, and then also your regular shots gained approach. So this year, I'm going to be incorporating both of those into my analysis, more so looking for plotters off the tee that are especially second shot specialists. Those are the players that found success in the top 5, top 10 last year. And based on what I saw in person with the eye test, it made a whole lot of sense. The course is going to be firmer after renovation. You also have thick, sticky Bermuda grass rough now as opposed to overseed like you had for a few of the seasons in the past. And you'll know if you're a golfer in the South that Bermuda grass is really hard to hit out of and extremely unpredictable compared to these other strains of grass. And this year, they're saying that the rough is a little bit lusher than what it was last year. So scoring could also get a little bit harder there, on top of them moving it from the par 71 to a par 70. But because there got so much rain yesterday and they're expected to get even more rain tonight, I don't think it's going to be as hard as it possibly could be. Like, I think if we get a year where it's firm and fast and fiery at Eastlake, there's a chance it plays even to an over par. But because of that rain that they're getting, it's probably still going to play at least a stroke under par again. So golf course isn't overly difficult. It's not a major championship type of test. In fact, the BMW Championship golf course is significantly harder than what we have for this Tour Championship. So, you might think that because it's the last event where the champion's going to get crowned, that it might be one of the harder golf courses that we're going to see. And that is not necessarily the case. It's It's Bomber's Paradise, relatively wide open. A lot of shots from 125 to 175. So still plenty of birdies that could be made out there. But for the weather for the first few days, it's not going to be as big a factor as what we normally have. A lot of times in bigger fields, we might get a little bit of a split over the first few rounds. But because there's only about 3 hours from the first to the last tee time, and I actually think it might even be a little bit less than that from the first to the last tee time, there's little to no chance for a weather edge. And you'll see in the Thursday forecast that it looks almost completely flat as well. You're talking about sub 10 miles an hour wind the entire day. In fact, close to 1 miles an hour for a majority of that round. And while there might be a little bit of a pop-up storm around 6 p.m., they're going to be finishing up play around then, if not completely finished by the time that storm heads through. So Thursday looks about as flat as we could possibly see. And then if we go to the NAM model, which we'll do for the Friday forecast, as it'll be fully loaded in at this point, it also looks extremely flat and maybe a slightly better chance of there being a storm in the afternoon. But even then, the winds look so flat at that point. In fact, the wind gusts are actually a little bit higher in the morning than the afternoon. So even if they have to play through a little bit of a sprinkle in the afternoon, the lower wind gusts probably make up for that. So over the first few rounds, I see little to no weather edge to really lean into. And maybe for showdown, like if there's going to be the wind kicking up one day where, maybe the first hour and a half, 2 hours of tee times are calmer than what we have for the rest of the day, maybe for showdown rounds 2 through 4, which we will be covering here on the channel as well, we could attack it with a little bit of a micro edge. But for rounds 1 and 2 and for main slate purposes, it doesn't look like there's that much to attack at this point. So I'll be looking at the round 1 averages when we get Data Golf to load those in for tomorrow. The first versus the second half of tee times is going to be something that I'm keeping a close eye on, but I'm not expecting there to be a really big split from that department. Before we start talking about actually building lineups, and it's important to go through some ownership as well as any player pool deep dives that you've got for me in the chat. So I'm going to bring up my projections next. These are from my Patreon page, a little bit different than what's posted on the SHIPIT Nation website. But I want to go from the 8K players and above with their ownership to give you guys an idea of where the field is going, because we can talk through course fit, the best plays of the week, leverage candidates, et cetera, et cetera. But the most important part about having a sound PGA DFS process, especially if you're playing in the large field GPPs or even like single entry sort of contest, is knowing that you're not just trying to build the best lineup that you can. If you're trying to do that, by the way, just enter in a cash or a double up, right? There are formats where if you just want to optimize for projection, you can do so, which is something that a lot of people do with my projections, especially the ones that I post on my Patreon page. I take a lot of pride in being a stat nerd and somebody that, in my opinion, has some, if not the most accurate projections that you have of all these different sites. But that's not what we're playing for the large field GPPs, right? We're not trying to optimize on projection. We're not trying to go out there and just say, give me the best 6 players that you can. We're trying to win first place in large field GPPs where there could be 20 to 30, 50,000 other entries. And those sort of formats, you not only have to have a really good lineup, you have to have a really good lineup that beats everyone else that you're playing against, which means if we can take players at lower ownership numbers, less people sharing them on anyone that you're using in your set of 6 players, that is going to be massive. And what makes this slate a little bit more unique is that we only have 30 players to choose from. So normally, even after the cut line, we've got like 65 to 70 at the very least that we have to play through. We have half of that. And this is going to be for all 4 rounds, right? This isn't just for, rounds 3 and 4 showdown this week. All 4 rounds, we're only going to have 30 players, which means your average ownership this week, and you've really got to calibrate your brain based on this, is 20%, right? There's 600% of ownership to go around. There's 6 spots in your DraftKings lineup, 30 players. That means the average ownership is 20%. So though Scotty Scheffler looks egregiously high owned, I mean, it's a normal slate, 38% would be just ridiculously high owned compared to the other guys around them. It's actually not that bad on a slate like this. He's only 10% higher owned than Rory. Now, part of the reason that he's only, I'll put that in quotes, 38% owned is because he's 14 grand, right? He's hard to fit into lineups. Even if you love a Scotty Scheffler, you've got to really like guys in the 6K range if you're going to make him work. But because the ownership is so condensed, and even in the 6K range, I know ownership's blacked out, but there are guys down here that are 15 to 16.9%. Like you can see there under Brian Harmon. A lot of times your highest owned 6K guy is like 4 to 5% owned. So ownership is just a completely different scenario this week. I would say that it's much more about leaving salary on the table. It's much more about the kind of contest that you're entering that you should be focusing on from this ownership perspective. But you could still generate a game theory edge in a week like this. It's not going to be as big a deal as you're getting a little bit more creative with your lineup construction to make sure that you're not duplicating yourself. But it can't be completely ignored, right? Because if you have a set of 6 players, even if you leave like $1,000 on the table that are all 25% plus owned, then even if all of your players hit, you're not going to have that much leverage on the rest of the field. And yeah, maybe you're unique because you left like $1,500 on the table, but you might not duplicate yourself, but the rest of the field is still going to have really good lineups as well because all the chalk ended up going off. So you can't completely ignore the ownership angle in a week like this, even if you plan on leaving that salary on the table, because getting differentiation is always helpful. It helps you pass up more people when your players go off, and that is always something that is valuable. But let's go through ownership. So we mentioned Scotty at nearly 40%. He is your highest owned player on the slate, as everyone could have probably guessed. But after that, there's not a really big range. Your highest owned players are around 28%. That for me is a Rory, a Tommy Fleetwood from 8K plus. And your quote unquote low owned players are players like a JT and a Cantlay that have got it about 16 to 17% respectively. So that's a 10 to maybe 11% range from your highest to your lowest owned players. And this is for large field GPPs. So this is meant for like the big $5 or $25. It is worth noting that it's single entries that the ownership gets more polarized. What I mean by that, we'll do the Spark Notes version. I could do a whole hour segment on this sort of stuff. I used to do it on a lot of the lineup review stuff that I would do on Mondays. But in single entries, the general trend is that ownership gets more polarized. By polarization, I mean that the higher owned guys are even higher owned and that the lower owned guys are even lower owned. So what happens is your players like a Tommy Fleetwood or Rory McIlroy will be well over 30% in single entry contests, whereas players that are being slightly squeezed, like for example, your Justin Thomases, your Cantlays that are closer to 16, 17%, will end up a lot lower owned than you would have expected ahead of time. So that's another thing to consider on this kind of slate, is that it also depends on the contest you're entering. If you're in a single entry and you really want to try and get a spot of differentiation, a lot of times your initial instinct is to go down to the 6K range, 7K range, because we have players that are sub 5% down there, but that's not the case this week. Like if you want to get your differentiation, you can do it pretty much wherever you want to, whether it's with your 9, your 10K options. Like even in the 10K range, you can get a little bit different by getting to a Love to Go Bear. It's a slightly different slate when it comes to that ownership angle. So you can't ignore ownership up top. And I would say especially on a slate like this, when the ownership down low is a lot higher than what we're used to seeing. A few other players that are worth noting with the ownership would be a Russell Henley. He's also getting a little bit of steam, would say, at about 25%. And then maybe even a Morikawa in the 8K range, which is kind of surprising to me, given that he's got some of the worst form of anyone in the field. In fact, he's got the second to worst form over his last 12 measured rounds, losing about 0.9 shots gained per round. But still, I think the $8,300 price tag, him being way too cheap and people trying to jam in as much Scotty Scheffler as they possibly can, is getting him a little bit more steam than a lot of these other players. So just keep that in mind with going through the ownership. I do have to cut it off at the 8K range, as I run my own site, my own projection page, as I've already told you guys at one point already. So I do have to cut it off to keep that behind the paywall. So if you guys want to do see this entire sheet completely uncensored, it's got my entire player pool on it, my bets, all the ownership for the bottom end of the board as well. You can check that out on my Patreon page. That is on my X/Twitter. It's in my bio. There's a link to it. Golf DFS tier is how you get access to these. So I do these for main site. I also do them for showdowns for rounds 2 through 4. So make sure to check that out as well. Now that we've gone through ownership, we can catch on any specific questions that you guys have. So I've got recent form on here over the last, I think, 7 or 8 events. I've got event history, shots gained over the last 24 and last 12 measured rounds that we can go through to do all these deep dives in chat. So if there's any players that we maybe haven't touched on quite yet, or any of your touts out there haven't, maybe given you your 2 cents on, this is what this live stream is going to be for. So feel free to hit me up in the live chat right now. So let's catch up, see what's going on down there, and get this thing going. What's going on? Big Rob says over under 50%. Scotty, I'm right about 50%. So I think it depends on what you want to do up top, like how many lineups you're entering. If you're entering 150, you're probably playing some Scotty Scheffler this week. If you're going with a single entry or only maybe 20 lineups, then there's a bigger argument for full fading a Scotty Scheffler. So I'm personally closer to that 50% mark myself. I'm not fully committing to him and also not taking a stance against him. That was what I did last week. It's what I've done for a lot of the season with the Scotty Scheffler. And I'm a 150 max player. So if I use him in 50% of my builds, that's 75. plenty of combinations to get it right with Scotty. And then I also have 75 lineups without a Scotty Scheffler. So hopefully that answers your question. And I would say that if you're going with less lineups, that you want to be more committed in either direction. Like, especially if you only have got like 3 to 20 lineups, go 100% or 0%. And you only have 10 lineups in either direction. If you went 50-50, that's not enough combinations to cover all your bases, right? Even 75, it's not like I can cover all the bases I want to, right? I have to prioritize the combinations that I want within those 75, but it's a lot better chance of me being able to cover those with 75 as opposed to 10, like in a 20 max formats. He said, if this is a driver heavy course, which bombers do I think have a chance to come out hot? It's a driver heavy course, but I wouldn't say it's a driving distance heavy course. So if you're looking for a bomber to get hot with the accuracy, because you're going to have to keep it in the short stuff if you want any chance to score around here, then maybe like an Aubert, one of these guys that's long and straight when he's playing his best golf. You don't really want the pot gators, even Bryson DeChambeau's that tends to get a little bit wayward even when he's playing good golf. This is a golf course after renovation that is much more positional than what it was before. So maybe your Auberts, Cantlay can get accurate when he's hot too. Maybe Sam Burns, those sort of players. But the accuracy is going to have to be there for sure. Can I explain what's going on with Goddard? He just went off a cliff. Yeah, that's golf, man. I mean, we've had a lot of guys that have done that this year. I mean, Andrew Novak looked like a god for one point. And then, I mean, at this point, he's number 30 in form heading into this event. We had players like Lowry last year that was on top of the mountain. I mean, he's top 5, top 10 in a FedEx Cup for pretty much the entire season. This year, he hardly snuck into the top 30. That's just the ebb and flows of golf. People have good stretches of form. They have bad stretches of form as well. When he won the Genesis, he had that really good top finish at the Open Championship as well. That was when he was, flowing. He was in that flow state, as they say, whether it was the golf swing was in a good spot. He was seeing the greens well. That happens. And that happens in every sport that you guys see, right? Guys get hot, batting in baseball, pitchers get hot. They go on like 5 to 6 game win streaks. Same thing. It happens in golf all the time. And I would actually say that golf's maybe an even bigger example of that, because a lot of your world's best players aren't always the best. Like Scotty Scheffler's the complete opposite of that. That's why he's so great. That's why he completely blows our mind when he's always really good. Like even as Xander, I mean, he won 2 majors last year. He was arguably player of the year. He probably shouldn't have won it last year over Scotty Scheffler, in my opinion. This year, he didn't even make the top 30. So like that's just golf. That happens with a lot of these players. Would not surprise me if in a couple weeks, maybe in the fall swing when he plays once or twice, that he wins one there, because he's clearly a high talent guy. He's clearly somebody that can get hot and win golf tournaments. I won't forget that about him. That's for sure. What's going on, Cody? Season wrap up. Yep. Fall swing is going to be fun though. So I'm looking forward to that. He said, is skipping the 10K range a good way to get different, or what would be the best way to get different in the 30 player field? So it depends on what you mean by getting different, right? Because I think there's 2 things that people really have coming to mind when they say that. It's either duplicating yourself or getting that leverage. If you're talking about duplicating yourself, you'll leave salary on the table, which we're going to do when we build a lineup here together. Or if you're trying to do it otherwise, right, just get that differentiation in there, you've got to mix in some low-owned plays. So I think it depends on exactly what you're looking for there. I don't think you have to avoid the 10K range, though. Like a lot of times, and I was kind of hinting at this with the average ownership and the fact that the 6K range is getting so much more steam. A lot of times, the guys in the 10K range are like 3-5 times the ownership of the rest of the field. That's not really the case here. And I know I don't have the ownership for the 6-7K range up, so maybe it's not easy to kind of convey to you guys. But down here, I mean, Brian Harman, it's not like he's the highest owned player in this range. He's 17% owned. We've got guys like Aubert up top that are 21% owned. I don't think by avoiding the 10K range, you're getting as different as you think you are. So yeah, it's more so about leaving salary on the table, trying to get some differentiation in there. It's a different week, though. A lot of times you'd be right? If you avoided the 10K range for a lot of these golf tournaments, you would be getting different by default. Not so much for this kind of slate. You feel like most of your lineups are Scheffler and a rotation of the 6 to 7K guys. Yeah, that's going to be a lot of people this week, man. 14K is hard to make work. If you want to use anyone respectable as a second man in, it's pretty much impossible. So yeah, you're going to be with a lot of the field doing so, but there's a good argument to be made for it. I mean, he's the world's best player by far. Let's see. And yeah, a lot of the field's going to be doing that. I can't argue. He said Bridgman or a Novak. So I don't really like questions with choosing between 2 players. I know my guy Tambo likes to just hit people with the coin flip there, but I'll give you some pros and cons for either one, and I'll let you make that decision for yourself, because at the end of the day, you want to be in control of your process. You don't want to just be getting your picks from touts, but I am the kind of person that will kind of lay it out for you. So with Bridgman, you have better form than Novak. Novak's number 30 in the field when it comes to the recent form ranking. However, Bridgman's also a little bit higher owned than you have with an Andrew Novak. So you've got to ask yourself, is the differentiation a really big deal? If it is, then Novak might be the player to use, especially if you're in a big field GPP. But if you're down to those two players and ownership's not that big of a deal to you, let's say that you're in a single entry or you've already differentiated and you're leaving some salary on the table, then Bridgman's probably the better play, at least per my projections. I project him a little bit better than Novak because of that recent form. But yeah, that's the laydown on that sort of combination, right? Kind of depends on the rest of your lineup, what you're looking at, what you're trying to do with your last man in. Because when we're building lineups, as we'll see here, when we build one together, you always want to have an intention about what you're trying to do, right? Sometimes we're just trying to get the best plays that we can into our lineups. That would be the Bridgman out of those two. And sometimes we're trying to play against the rest of the field, and that would be where you'd want to take an Andrew Novak. Let's see. Yeah, we're going to talk about leaving salary on the table, but I would say you can leave up to $2, even $3,000 on the table, and it wouldn't be crazy in a 30-player field. He said, thoughts on Spawn? He's played well in 2 of the reference courses. Yeah, comps that I'm looking at, but against an easier field at Sony. So he plays well at positional courses, and I'd say the renovation does him wonders around the Tour Championship. Beforehand, it was a little driver heavy, a little bit of a bomb and gouge before they added in that Bermuda grass sticky rough. So I've got him as a decent play this week, probably a 6.5 out of 10. He projects better than some of the other guys in the 8K range. So I'm personally going to be using him in some lineups. And a lot of it's the course fit. So I think the renovation, we'll have to see if it holds up this year. But based on how it played in 2024, I like his chances. Harry Hall 1 through 10, I'll give him a 7 out of 10, Jason. That's without ownership being incorporated, though, which we'll talk about in a second. 7 out of 10 because of the form. He's playing some of the best golf of anyone in the field. In terms of his recent form ranking, I can give you an exact number on Harry Hall, but he's number 5 in the category. He's gaining 1.7 shots gained per round. So he's a good Bermuda grass putter. It is his first time ever playing at Eastlake. So that is the one critique, the one criticism that we could give for a Harry Hall play. But this also isn't a golf course, Eastlake Golf Club, that is super experience dependent. It's not like the, Augusta National or the Masters where you've got to have a few starts before you really have a fighting chance to get into contention. We've seen first timers have a lot of success at Eastlake before. So yeah, Harry Hall, 7 out of 10. Now, what is worth noting, and I know the ownership's blacked out here, is that he is the highest owned player that we have in this range. So, if ownership is something that is a pressing issue for you, then that could be of concern with using a Harry Hall. But let's say you've already got differentiation and you're leaving some salary on the table, then by all means, Harry Hall is, I think, an excellent play this week. What's going on, Ross? And says, what's going on, Luke? Nothing much. And yeah, let's have a week. Just chilling, honestly. Didn't have as much to do this week because there's only 30 players. I like to do my due diligence on everyone in the field. So when there's 156 guys, it takes quite a bit of time. When there's 30 players, not so much. So it's been a more laid back week, but still excited for the golf to come. He said start lineups with Henley or another flag plant player. So he said in terms of uniqueness or getting doomed out of the gate, I don't really know what you're asking, to be honest, man. It seems like a lot of just kind of like your internal thoughts being thrown into that sort of a comment. But let's start with the first part there, because that is, I guess, really the only question that you asked. But could you start lineups with Henley? For sure. Like I mentioned that you don't have to fade the 10K range, but you obviously could as well. I'm going to have a lot of lineups that start with Tommy Fleetwood. He's one of my core plays. I like him there at a more respectable price tag. I mean, if you start with Fleetwood, you can take 2 or 3 guys from 9K plus. So it's not just who you play, it's how you play them. I know we talk about a lot of that with the ownership angle, and like you can play chalk in 1 or 2 spots if you want to, but it's also if you play Scotty Scheffler, like sure, he's a great, by far the best projecting player this week. He's a core play for me. Like I'm going to have a lot of Scotty Scheffler, but if you use him, you can't use 2 to 3 guys in that 9K range. So I like lineups that start in that 9K range as opposed to the 10K range, not so much because of the ownership angle, but because of what it opens up salary-wise. So yeah, I could get behind that. Henley is maybe not my favorite player in that range. I do prefer Tommy just a little bit more, but I like hammering a lot of those players in general, like a JT, a Hovland, by the way, who are also 9K range players. I'll have some of the best course history around an Eastlake Golf Club of anyone in the field. In fact, Hovland's number 3, I believe JT's number 1 in the field with history around here. So that's another reason that I really like that range. Are we worried that Brian Harmon will find a bridge to live under? Shout out to DGen on that. Yeah, he's the troll that lives under the bridge. Yeah, that's a concern, but maybe that means that he'll get to the course earlier. It can grind a little bit more, but yeah, shout out to my guy James. That was his nicknames for players were just goated. No one's even close to it, that's for sure. What course comp do I like for East Lake? So I'll show you these. So I have them over on this right tab, but I have 3 that really came to mind, and it's shorter positional Bermuda grass tracks. And this course isn't necessarily short. I mean, it's 7,400 yards, but it plays pretty short, and it played pretty short last year. So the FedEx St. Jude, that was TPC Southwind, Bermuda grass, rough. You really have to hit the fairways to have a chance there. I think that's going to be the case this week. Same thing at Sedgefield Country Club. That's the home of the Wyndham Championship. And then Waialae, that's the last one I have down here. It's another shorter Bermuda grass track. That one was from earlier in the year, though. So these 2 are from the last month, which I think maybe adds a little bit of a bonus effect. The Sony Open one, though, does give us a look at some of the earlier season stuff. So maybe somebody that was struggling over the last month and, didn't play their best at these top 2 courses, you could try and find some comp course history from the Sony Open a little bit earlier in the year. So I know somebody mentioned that with JJ Spawn, right? He had a really good week at the Sony Open. That's a little bit of a boost to players around this track. Let's see. Thoughts on fading Scheffler in 150 lineups? Implied odds of him winning are about his ownership. Yep, that's correct. And you said, if he doesn't win, then he's not worth the money. Yeah, I mean, there's an argument to be made for that. I obviously don't agree with it. I think that he's going to win this thing, so I'm using him. But if you're not as completely sold on him being a really good play, then yeah, fade him, right? That's definitely a viable strategy. I would say that that's not where I'm going. That's why I'm not going to co-sign that sort of a thing. But it's far from a wild thing to completely, fade him, because you would be getting 40% leverage right there. The one thing I will say, though, man, is that if you fade Scotty Scheffler, that's not enough. Like, you're not going to have enough leverage just by making that one decision. You're going to have a lot of lineups that don't have Scotty Scheffler in it that still duplicate with like 100 to 1,000 other entries. So you've still got to leave some salary on the table. You still have to get some differentiation, which, if that's the case, and this is where I stand on it, again, doesn't mean it's 100% correct. It's just my take on the slate, is if you still have to get different after excluding a Scotty Scheffler, then what's the point of it? Like, that's the whole reason why you want to fade him, right? Is like, oh, I'm getting leverage against the rest of the field. It's still only 30% of lineups, or 38% of my projections that are using them this week. It doesn't do as much as a lot of people probably think by fading a Scotty Scheffler. So it's not crazy. It's not something that is completely outlandish, but not my favorite move on this sort of golf tournaments. Let's see. You said, what if Scheffler gets 4th and 1 through 3 are $7,000 and under? That's exactly right. He could still technically get there, but he is also right, though, Yob. If he doesn't win, he's most likely not going to be in the optimal lineup, but there is at least a chance that he gets there. He said, smash those likes in your first run. You got 100% Scotty. Should you be alarmed by it? No, you could run 100% Scotty if you want to. I would say, especially if you have less than 150 lineups, like 20 or less, then it really shouldn't alarm you that much at all. But if you do have a whole portfolio to work with, it's a bold decision, but it's not crazy. Just like, fading Scotty Scheffler 0% isn't crazy. Using him in 100% wouldn't be that crazy either. You said you're either going no Scotty or all in with your 20 lineups. I like that. I think that's the proper thing to do if you don't have a full set of 150. You said if you're playing a single bullet, should you just fade Scotty? That's the question, man. I don't think anyone can answer that for you but yourself, though. So that's I don't know. In single entries, it's worth noting with Scotty that he could be close to 50%. So it's going to be pretty much a coin flip on whether a lineup has him or not. Is that, how do I feel about Sanjay? He really charged up Sunday to get into the top 30. Yeah, I'm happy for him. I'm really surprised, though, that he even made this golf tournament. I mean, he had like 2 top 15 finishes in the last 3 months. So happy for him. I call him Sunday for a reason. He's one of my favorite players that we have in this field, but I don't know. I'm a little sketched out by the form. I hope that he has a good week. He's going to be low into GPPs as well. So, he's a pretty good leverage spot if you're looking to do that. But his projection is really suffering because of that form. So, yeah, that's the lowdown of my guy, Sanjay. And he said, the odds of that are negligible. I don't know about that, man. That's it could happen. I would say that you're right most of the time, but we've had it happen a few times here before. I mean, this is the first time. I shouldn't even say that because it's so much different this time around as well. We've had almost every time in the past, the chalk has gone there in the 10K range because we've had starting strokes. There's no starting strokes this time around, right? So you have to kind of look at it as a regular event. And in regular events, are there times where the 7K range is up there with just one guy in the 10Ks? Yeah, that happens quite often. on the PGA Tour. So he's not wrong for saying that, but you are right more often than not, I would say. It's there's a good chance that it is going to be a 10K guy that gets there if Scotty doesn't, but it's not 100% the case. He said Rose is getting that top 4. You heard it there first from my guy Yob. Let's go through building a lineup together. So I want to show you guys this in actual practicality, but building lineups this week is a little bit more complicated than most. A lot of that because of how condensed the ownership is, but also because you have to leave salary on the table to really have any chance of not duplicating yourself. So what I did in my set of 150 lineups is I set a cap at $49,500. I'm not spending within $500 of the max. And part of the reason for that is that even if I tried to force in like a product ownership cap, there's no possible way for me to build lineups under my product ownership cap. The way that I do it, and I'm playing in a contest with over 40,000 entries this week for my 150 max exposure, is the way that I normally do it is I want my product ownership to be less than 1 over the total amount of entries. So I do 1 over, in this case, like 40,000. Yeah, I do the exact amount of entries, but we'll do the mental math there. And then that's my product ownership cap. There is quite literally 0 combinations, and I'm not exaggerating. There's not one combination. I could use the 6 lowest owned players on the slate, and they are not below that product ownership cap. So my strategy for getting differentiation and making sure that I'm not going to have the same exact combination as somebody else just doesn't work on a week like this. So I have to adapt. I have to get a little bit different. And I think for some people that might be a little bit overwhelming. You know, they get comfortable with what they do every single week and they don't really want to change it up all that much. And I get that. That's kind of a natural human instinct whenever you have this sort of change, but it's not that difficult to account for. And I'll give you guys a little bit of advice right here. If you leave $500 on the table with all of your 150 max lineups, it does not mean that you're not going to duplicate yourself with any of them, but it does give you a better chance. And what you do is you set maybe that salary cap, which could be 49.5. You could bump it up $200, subtract it $200 if you want to. It doesn't really matter, right? That's kind of arbitrary where you set that sort of number, but then you set a product ownership cap, but you don't make it as stringent as what it was before. So you don't want to have a whole bunch of lineups that's just playing all the 6 chalkiest guys together. You want to set a product ownership cap that eliminates those sort of builds, but actually allows you to build 150 lineups. So it took me a lot of tinkering. I had to mess around with that probably like 50 times before I actually got my optimizer to run 150 lineups because, you know, I'm being very specific about what I want, right? I want lineups that, you know, are still legit lineups that I can actually enter, but that aren't going to be the chalk of the chalk. So, you know, a lot of times it's a lot easier for me to go out there and accomplish that sort of thing. This week, it took a little bit of finagling for me to be able to get that job done. So let me kind of show you what that would look like. If you're building by hand, it's not quite as difficult though. It is going to be harder to get a gauge on whether you have enough leverage in your lineup though. So let's start and let's avoid Scotty in this lineup. Because I think if you avoid Scotty, that you get a slightly more interesting lineup construction. If you use a Scotty Scheffler right off the bat, that puts you down to $7,200, which means that you're just going to be hammering that 6 and 7K range. And, you know, if we're leaving salary on the table, that really means that we're going to be living in that 6K range for probably 4 of those last 5 spots. So I don't know. It feels like that's going to be a very like flat lineup construction. There's not going to be as much that you can really do with it. However, if you go down to, let's say, starting with a Fleetwood instead, another one of my core plays, let's go with Victor Hovland as our second man in. Let's throw in a JJ Spawn, who I mentioned as a play that I thought can make some sense. In this case, we've already got 3 players on there, 3 solid guys that are in the top 10 of the outright betting odds, and we still have $7,500 remaining, which means we can still use another 8K guy if we want to. We can even take another spend up in the lower end of the 9K range and probably make it work and still leave salary on the table and not only be taking 6K guys. Like it gives you so much more flexibility to work with your pieces here. So let's throw in a JT. Let's be really aggressive with our salary. Let's throw in a Brian Harman at $6,500 as well. And because this is us building for like the big $5 or $25 GBP with $7,000 remaining in terms of salary, because of how I'm building in my 150 max, I won't be using anyone from $6,600 and above. I'm going to be limited to these bottom 5 players to ensure that I'm not going to have the exact same combination as other people. And yeah, I mean, that's really the main reason for it. I guess I was thinking of something else to add there, but there's not really anything on top of that really matters. Duplicating yourself is the worst thing you can do with those large field GPPs. And it's not just the fact that you're dealing with leverage problems, but it's also because they're so top heavy with the payouts. first place gets such a big portion of the payouts in these contests that if you're duplicating yourself, it's just tanking your long-term ROI. So that's why we're so focused on that aspect and really getting that differentiation. And I do have to say that avoiding the Scotty Scheffler gives us more access to the 8 and 9K range, which is also why I think the ownership is in check over there. And I know we were showing the ownership before, but there we had guys in that range that were 15 to 16% owned, and players in the 6K range that are going to be over 20%. Like, it's just such a backward slate from what we're used to. And a lot of that comes down to Scotty, right? If you're going to use Scotty, you have to play the 6K range. And I mean, just to show you that, let's throw in Scotty and then a Spawn as our second man in, who would be a pretty aggressive second man in at that point. Now we have $7,000 remaining for our last 4 players. We have to live at the bottom end of the board. And because so many people want to use the Scotty Scheffler this week, and it's for good reason, he's by far the best player that we have in the world. It is irrefutable at this stage. Because everyone wants to use the world's best player, all of these guys are like double the ownership of what they otherwise would be. So I would say it's a lot of really bad, nasty plays, guys that shouldn't be as highly owned as they should be towards the bottom, which is why as the week has gone on, I've gone even more entranced or even more attracted to some of these lineups starting with the 9K players. And it's not just a Fleetwood that I'll be doing it with, but like your Henleys, your Hovlands, your Justin Thomases. I love all 4 of these players this week. So that's going to be where a lot of my exposure is going. And with my Scotty Scheffler lineups, it adds a little bit of hassle, right? Because the ownership is so spread out. It's not like going with the studs and duds approach, which for the first leg of the playoffs, when we had 70 players, I mentioned that if you use a Scotty Scheffler, it forced you towards the bottom end of the board, which kind of helped out with the ownership angle. This time around, that's not the case, right? The ownership is just so condensed down there that you're not getting that differentiation that it takes away some of the utility of using a Scotty. So that's the laydown on this week, a little bit of a unique one, if I had to say so myself. But best of luck with everything that you guys are entering this week, whether it's in the large field GPPs, cash lineups, single entries, you name it. I hope you guys are able to take down as many contests as possible. Stop on by for the round 2 through 4 live streams. We'll be doing those after play ends over the next few rounds, giving you guys an idea of how to attack the single game slates. My Patreon page is where you can find all of my projections and my player pool for this week. Also for rounds 2 through 4 showdown, I post all my stuff over there. And for all the prop and betting stuff for rounds 1 at this event, I'm going to be doing a live stream in about 25 minutes. So at 8 p.m. Eastern time on my YouTube channel, I'm going to be going through the pick'em stuff on Underdog and Prize Picks, giving you guys an idea of exactly how Eastlake Golf Club's going to play. We'll talk through weather, pin locations, maybe even some Euro golf props as well. I'll at least take a look at the board and go through any questions that you have over there to give you guys the lowdown for Thursday's golf action. And last week on the prop side of things was an absolute banger. I believe it was like a plus 16 unit week or something like that. I'd have to go back and get count. I know it was over a 12 plus unit week in terms of profit, right? I'm not talking about just cashes. That's a pure profit in terms of that right there. So riding hot, hopefully can keep that momentum going into this event and maybe make it an even better DFS week. Last week, 4 of my core plays went T7 or better. I had McIntyre to win, so that was a little heartbreaking with Scotty ripping my heart out right there. But I took down a few GPPs because of it, so I can't really complain all that much. It would have been nice to add an outright bet on top of that, but we've got momentum across the board. So let's see if we can continue that into this golf tournament, cap off the season with a little bit of a bang. And I'll see you guys for some of that content throughout the rest of the week.